From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Friday last week, Keir Starmer went to Washington and held talks with Joe Biden.
Prime Minister, welcome back to the White House. Often said, there's no issue of global consequence for the United States and the states that we can't work together.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
There was more excitement than usual.
What do you say to Vladimir Putin's threat of war, sir? It's a serious threat.
You got to be quiet. I'm going to make a statement, okay?
As ever, there's a list as long as a phone book of global issues to discuss. But the Prime Minister had one in particular at the top of his mind.
And it's really important for us, great allies, that special relationship, to have this time to talk about the global issues you have just identified, starting, of course, with Ukraine, where I think the next few...
Issues starting, of course, with Ukraine, Starmer said. The bone of contention between the two leaders centres around a powerful weapon called Storm Shadow. British-donated missiles that Ukraine wants to use on Russian targets. The UK seems okay with letting them do that, but the Americans aren't sure, fearing the wrath of Putin.
If this decision is made, it will mean nothing other than direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, European countries, in the war in Ukraine.
Is Biden right to be worried? Or is this all part of a wider plan by the president to bring us closer to some kind of peace? The story today: storm shadows and the endgame in Ukraine.
I'm Mark Urban, writer and columnist for The Sunday Times.
Mark Urban, 30 years as Newsnight diplomatic editor and now writing for The Sunday Times, has been there, done that, got the Ukrainian Revolution t-shirt.
I was in the Maidan Square in 2013 when the revolution started in Ukraine. Then I covered the referendum in Crimea the next May when the Russian troops effectively took over Crimea and it was absorbed into Russia. And then subsequently, I have been involved in covering the war in its more intense phase since the large-scale invasion of February 2022.
OK, so can we start, Mark? There seems to be a bit of excitement that the UK is somewhat peeling ahead of other Western nations in terms of how willing they are to give Ukraine kit that it can use to directly attack Russia. I mean, to your mind, what is actually going on there?
Ukraine has been really trying to ratchet up the pain level for the Russians during this summer with long-range strikes. Now, a lot of these use what are, in effect, big model aeroplanes, drones so-called with explosive warheads. And they fly pretty slowly. I mean, they can be in the air for 2 hours going from somewhere in Ukraine to somewhere deep in Russia. But they've been doing a lot of that this summer. But they also want the ability to hit targets that are in the few hundreds of kilometers away from where they would be launched with something that goes much faster and hits much harder. So the Storm Shadow is distinctive because it's launched from an aeroplane. It flies much faster. It's nearly at the speed of sound than some of these drones, which complicates the Russians' defense against them. And it can, zigzag around. It can try and avoid Russian defensive systems, all that stuff. And when it hits the target, it does so with greater force because it's got a warhead which has a first element which is designed, if you like, to break in, and then a second element which is the main explosive charge. Now, you might think, well, what's that for? Or why did they design it that way? And the answer simply is things like bunker busting. So if, for example, you're hitting an airbase deep in Russia, you might use some of those other drones that the Ukrainians have got to hit the aeroplanes when they're parked beside the airfield, because they are relatively soft things, aeroplanes, or fragile things. And if you create a large explosion on or very near them, you can damage or destroy them. But if those aeroplanes have been put inside what are called hardened shelters, so it's a hangar with concrete roof and walls, or indeed you're trying to hit the command center at that airbase, then the Storm Shadow is a much more effective weapon.
And they've already used it, we should say, in Russian-occupied Crimea. So it has already hit, quote-unquote, Russian territory.
A British Storm Shadow cruise missile streaks across occupied Crimea. And this was the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol as a Storm Shadow struck.
Britain is enthusiastically backing Ukraine's case to use these. President Biden is a lot less enthusiastic about letting that happen. And are they crossing a Rubicon? Because as you've just said, these missiles, originally they're a French design. So the French have also sent a very similar missile called Scalp. Now, if you're a red-blooded Russian nationalist, you regard Crimea, where they've been used, as just as much a part of Russia as, Voronezh or Murmansk or, any other provincial part of Russia. Now, clearly to Ukrainians, it's occupied land. But this idea that, if you take one step over the line into Russia proper, you're going to cross a whole set of Rubicons and red lines and all the rest of it, has obviously been eroded because, yes, many targets have been hit in Crimea with all sorts of weapons. And many targets have now been hit across the borders in Russia itself with certain weapons like the artillery missile system called HIMARS. And also, of course, with all these literally hundreds in the last few months of these Ukrainian drones. Now, the politics of this, if you're sitting in Washington, is that, no, it's quite different to use something supplied by the West to something made in Ukraine, like those drones. And President Putin himself seemingly working away on that uncertainty, on that political difference, of course, has made his statement a couple of days ago.
If this decision is made, it will mean nothing other than direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, European countries, in the war in Ukraine. It is their direct participation, and this, of course, significantly changes the very essence of the conflict. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries, are fighting with Russia.
If you use these missiles because NATO satellites are required to gather the intelligence and the terrain information that are fed into these missiles to guide them, that requires NATO servicemen and women. Once you're doing that, you're sort of waging war on Russia directly.
Yes, but is all this inevitable? Because to my uninitiated, undiplomatic mind, it seems like just the next step in a continuing conveyor belt. We had the argument over tanks. We had the arguments over fighter jets. We're now having the argument over Storm Shadow. And it seems like we all know it will happen eventually. It's just they feel like they need to go through the motions, or there's a long period of reflection.
I think there's different ways of looking at this. The first is that a good deal of Western leadership, we've talked about President Biden, but if you look at Olaf Scholz in Germany, even more so, has been very reluctant to take steps which they believe would bring closer the possibility of war between Russia and Western countries, not between Russia and Ukraine. Now, of course, President Putin has worked away at that anxiety and tried to exploit it. Some people call it self-deterrence by the Western countries, that they've talked themselves into a situation where they won't do certain things because President Putin has made certain threats. But at the back of it all is this nagging uncertainty. If you get this wrong and we do actually trigger some kind of open conflict with Russia, I guess that's a place where a lot of people don't want to be. Now, the enthusiastic backers of Ukraine say, the Russians would soon get smashed by NATO. And in many ways, given the difficulty they've had with Ukraine, to then have a war with NATO as well would clearly be disastrous for Russia. But I think the problem is this: it's the nuclear threshold. And it's quite interesting that as this debate has been going on, the weekend before last, we had the head of the CIA in London giving a talk in which he revealed that in the summer of 2022, the late summer, September-ish, I think, when things were going very badly wrong for the Russians, when the Ukrainians were retaking a big section of the east of the country, that serious preparations were detected by American intelligence to use Russian nuclear weapons.
None of us should take lightly the risks of escalation. There was a moment in the fall of 2022 when I think there was a genuine risk of, the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. I have never thought, however, and this is the view of my agency, that we should be unnecessarily intimidated by that.
Of course, being an intelligence boss, he's not going to tell us exactly what they detected and whether, they thought there was a 10% chance of this or an 80% chance of this. But I mean, it's that kind of thing which I think causes President Biden to be cautious.
And cautious as well because it's not exactly, to conclude the debate about Storm Shadow, it's not exactly a game changer. It's not a war winner. It's not like they will say, yes, Ukraine, you can use these missiles on Russian targets and then victory is certain. It sort of necessarily wouldn't move the dial that much as well.
Is any single weapon system going to make really an enormous difference? And, some of the people who are more skeptical about this sort of use this term Wunderwaffe, which refers back to really the German belief in the latter part of the Second World War that certain weapons like the V2 rocket could suddenly turn everything round for them and change the situation in the war as a whole. I don't quite hold with that. I think that, for example, supplying fighter planes, modern Western fighters like the F-16 to Ukraine obviously is going to make a difference. We shouldn't be too cynical about it. But in a massively complex struggle in which there are layers and layers of weaponry and targets and defenses of targets, it is unlikely that Storm Shadows on their own would make a dramatic difference. When you're looking at this question of hitting one another's infrastructure, you've got all sorts of different weapons you can use to do it. That means that the Russians have to defend against all sorts of different methods of attack. And similarly, Ukraine, during these years of war now, has had to build a layered defense to try and stop the Russians using all these different similar forms of attack, drone, cruise missile, ballistic missile, against their key bits of infrastructure, whether that's air bases, power stations, you name it. So that all means the complexity of those equations about trying to hit one another's key targets means that a single weapon is unlikely to prove decisive.
Mark, President Zelensky has this victory plan, which he says he's going to show President Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as well at some of their meetings around the UN this weekend. What possibly could be in it, do we think, first of all?
I think the sort of connecting thought as we discuss this and we move on to that question is that this smashing of one another's infrastructure, it's very damaging to both societies. We know, for example, about Ukrainian electricity generation being way down by more than half over a year ago because of the damage that Russia has done. Now, if you look at the damage that Ukraine has been doing to Russia, they have also been hitting some facilities, like oil storage facilities, power distribution, as well as the military targets. And when we start to talk about, is there conceivably an endgame here? This question about the damage that the two sides are doing to one another's vital national infrastructure is quite important. If Putin said what he said a few days ago because he's rattled, it is partly because it would appear that military pressure is increasing on Russia. Now, that is definitely a deliberate strategy by Zelensky, and that plays into this victory plan, he's called it. So what are the elements of the victory plan? And this is speculation. This is not something I've been told by someone in a position of power. But reading into some of Zelensky's recent statements, where he has talked about buffer zones and things like that, you might say, look, if we're going to have a ceasefire, and that's a very, very big if still at this point, what we would want to do is draw back troops on both sides a certain distance. So we would have disengagement zones. Obviously, Ukraine would step back from those areas it's occupied inside Russia. So in that sense, it would be a bargaining chip. And that would explain its context within this wider way of thinking that Zelensky seems to be about to unveil.
Because how ready do you think the Ukrainians are to have that conversation even?
There's big problems on both sides. And Luke, if you were to ask me the question, are the two sides ready to make peace? I think the answer to that is probably no. The war has engendered such unhappiness, pain, bitterness, all of those things. People in Ukraine can't forget, the atrocities at Bucha, the shelling of Kharkiv, constant random shelling, killing people in the streets, the shelling of Kherson down in the south of the country, similarly, just seemingly randomly targeting people going about their daily business. All of these things, and of course the heavy losses on the front there in the Donbass, all of these things make it very, very hard for Ukraine to accept that they should just sit down and, particularly accept that Putin has gobbled up a significant part of their country. On the Russian side, obviously, Putin is not under the same pressures as Zelensky's. He doesn't have real politics in the way that there is real politics to a certain extent in Ukraine. And so Putin is not under the same pressures. And of course, he still appears to cleave to these objectives of, what he would call denazification. In other words, just overrunning Ukraine, deposing its government, its elected government, and basically turning it into a thoroughly weakened state under Russian domination. So if either side tries to attain those maximal objectives through peace talks tomorrow, I think it's very unlikely to work. It's very unlikely to bring about a peace. I think the questions that we face going into this winter are, both sides are having increasing difficulty recruiting and training enough soldiers to carry on this conflict. I mean, hundreds of thousands probably of soldiers have died. Certainly, when you add in the wounded as well as the dead who can no longer fight, several 100,000 people have been taken out of this battle. We know that the strikes on Russian infrastructure have both alarmed many Russians and are causing Putin pain. And, we know that he's having difficulty raising troops. So there are some issues now which are affecting Russia rather negatively. I noticed that the head of Ukrainian military intelligence said a couple of days ago that he reckons that by the middle of next year, Russia will be in serious trouble on various planes, manpower, economy, all sorts of things. Well, okay, that's his estimate. But I think what you can say is things are no longer going Putin's way in the way they were a few months ago by virtue of the deep strikes, the heavy, heavy losses that they've taken in the Donbass fighting without really significant breakthroughs, and the incursion in the Kursk area. So where are we heading? Are we heading to a situation where both countries, because of the difficulties they're in, the Ukrainian worries about going into this winter with only part of its electricity and power generation system in place, all of those things are weighing on the minds of two sides? Could you, in that circumstance, have some sort of ceasefire? Well, up to now, Ukraine has been very reluctant to consider that because they worry that that just locks in Russia's gains. All the territory they've taken in the east and south of the country would just be locked in by that. Personally, I think the idea is very unlikely that you could have any sort of comprehensive peace agreement in the next month or two. But consider also that we now know that last month there were supposed to be talks in Qatar in the Gulf,
yes,
in which apparently the Russians and the Ukrainians had agreed to sit down and talk about stopping strikes on one another's national infrastructure. In other words, the power stations, oil storage, railways, that sort of stuff. The talks were postponed. But it does suggest that Russia also is feeling the pain, and that some sort of agreement in which the deep strikes stop was, in theory, something they wanted to talk about. Now, if you were to add a more general ceasefire to that, to try and give, for example, the Ukrainians a chance to get through this coming winter, it might be something that would appeal. And of course, from the Russian perspective, if you see in November that Donald Trump doesn't win the election, the idea of stopping this, at least for a while, and possibly so that you can move to some deeper, longer-term solution, starts to become more appealing.
Yeah. So if that's the case, Mark, that some kind of ceasefire or, attempt at peace will come not from a victor and a loser, but come from, I guess, a sort of level of exhaustion on each side. You mentioned the US there. What is the role of other nations allied to either side stepping in and putting a hand on the shoulder of their exhausted ally and saying, now's time?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating one. This is one of the other straws in the wind at the moment. There is a certain amount of speculation or discussion in Whitehall about whether President Biden has taken the stance he has on these missiles simply because he doesn't want to risk a bigger war with Russia, or because he does see an opportunity with this mutual exhaustion. And let's face it, if there is back-channel diplomacy going on through places like Qatar, he will know more about it than we do. Whether he sees some sort of opportunity to stop the fighting, does he see that as a possibility to give himself some kind of presidential legacy? Now, this is clearly speculation, but sensible people in Whitehall have speculated along these lines in recent weeks. Could this be what lies behind Biden's attitude? It's a very interesting thought. If there is some substance to this, and we get to a point in the next month or two where Biden sees a real opportunity to do this, I think Ukraine will say, look, we may be up for turning this off during this winter for all the reasons of, reconstituting the power grid, everything else, giving people some kind of respite from the war. But we don't want Putin to exploit this opportunity to rearm, rebuild better than we can.
But finally, Mark, you can see that happening even after maybe the November presidential election if Kamala Harris wins, because then it's, this sort of continuity Biden is coming down the track. So I guess, the Ukrainians and the Russians can buy into whatever Biden is saying. If Donald Trump wins, of course, and we know his running mate, J.D. Vance, is, quite pro pulling the plug entirely on the US aid given to Ukraine, this war could be over by Christmas, couldn't it? Disastrously for Ukraine, maybe, but, it would be a complete shake-up of what's happening.
The potential for tragedy is that if Putin sees that there is a real weariness, a greater weariness on the Ukrainian side, and if he sees the friendly face of Donald Trump in the White House, he's then tempted to just go all out through the winter and into next year in an attempt to decide the thing militarily. That's clearly the risk here. Conversely, if it's a Kamala Harris presidency, does that then play a big role in making Putin think, look, I've expended a huge number of soldiers' lives trying to get a breakthrough during the summer of 2024, and it's not worked. I'm taking more and more damage on my national infrastructure, and there's no sign of aid to Ukraine stopping soon. Some people even say Kamala Harris could be more forward-leaning in that respect than Biden. So yes, those undoubtedly will be enormous factors in any decision-making by Putin.
Mark Urban, a new contributor and columnist for the Sunday Times. His first piece was in the paper on Sunday. It is well worth a read. You can get it at thetimes.com if you're a subscriber. We'll pop a link in the episode description. The producers today were Edward Drummond and Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Kate Ford. And sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. If you can, leave us a review wherever you're listening. It will help other people find us. I'm Luke Jones, and I'll see you soon.